I mean, if we're talking about undermining democracy and lying, I think Brexit and the way that it was delivered undermined democracy. Prorogue in Parliament, voter ID, corruption on COVID, free ports and special economic zones.
Growth is flatlining or actually technically going into recession, and because our population is growing, in fact, GDP per capita, so the wealth per person, has actually been declining. Well, welcome to The Rest is Politics with me, Rory Stewart.
And with me, Alastair Campbell.
And Alastair, it's a sort of bizarre thing. It's morning where you are in Australia, and it's evening where I am in America.
I know, and yet you sound like you're next door. And I've just been swimming in this amazing open air seawater pool on Bondi Beach, which is just such a great start to the day.
Very jealous.
So there's the sun coming up over the sea.
I've been teaching students and doing office hours, so I'm not as glamorous. I wish I'd been.
And we'll talk a little bit about what's going on here in Australia and also the war in Sudan in the second half of the programme. But I think in the first half, we're going to talk about kind of more domestic. We've got the budget coming up. We had that rather bizarre Downing Street address by Rishi Sunak on the back of the Rochdale by-election won by the repellent George Galloway. And so should we start with that? Should we start with what on earth was Sunak up to?
Yeah, encourage our international listeners. Quite a lot of Sudan and Australia in the second half. But quick bit on the Rochdale by-election and this character, George Galloway. I mean, it's almost impossible to describe him in any very straightforward way. George Galloway has, I believe, I've tried to count, stood 15 times for elected office.
Mm-hmm.
So he was a Labour MP from 1987 to 2005. Then he was in Glasgow Hillhead and Glasgow Kelvin. Then from 2005-2010, he was an MP in Bethnal Green and Bow. Lost his seat 2010. 2011 stood in Scotland and lost. 2012 stood in Bradford West for the Respect Party and won his seat there, which he lost again in 2015. Then he got entered a very, very bleak moment for the last 9 years. I mean, the figures were catastrophic. He stood for London Mayor in 2016, came 7th with 1.4% of the vote. To put that in context, when I was running to be London Mayor as an independent, I think we were up at sort of 13-14%. He then ran 2017 Manchester Gorton, got 5.7%, ran 2019 West Bromwich East, came 6th with only 489 votes. That's not many votes, right? Less than 500 votes. Stood in Scotland in 2021, got 0.9% of the vote, and stood in Batley and Spen and came 3rd with 21%. And then, after 9 years of not getting anywhere, came in again in Rochdale with a whopping 40% of the vote, overturning a Labour majority of 9,668. So tell us, when did you first encounter George Galloway?
I first encountered George Galloway face-to-face in Dundee, where he was very active. Dundee, twin town Nablus, so there's a sort of history of links with Palestine.
Where he's born.
Yeah.
He claims he grew up in an Irish attic tenement in Dundee and made his name first in Dundee City Council as a very young man.
Yeah, I think fair to say that whenever you're talking about Galloway, claims and alleges is probably the best way to deal with it. And the reason I met him there was because I was doing an investigation for the Daily Mirror about War on Want, a charity with which he was very, very closely associated.
He was the head. He was, or at least the London head of something.
He had a senior position at War on Want, a great charity. And essentially the story was of sort of financial misgoings on at the charity. And it was quite interesting because that was my first encounter. And of course, I'd set it up on the basis of wanted to interview him about this, that, and the other, didn't really explain what it was all about. And then when it came to it, put some very, very tough questions with plenty of evidence of invoices and expenses claims and all sorts of things. At which point he turned, as I think a lot of journalists have experienced since, quite sort of nasty and aggressive. Anyway, the paper ran the story. That was all fine. My next major encounter with him was in court. And I've got to be careful what I say here because this was a court of law where, of course, people can say whatever they want. And I was being sued by this Tory MP, Rupert Allison, over a story that I hadn't even written. It was completely bizarre. It was amazing it ever even got to court because it was a story that another journalist had written. But Rupert Allison was determined to sue me personally for malicious falsehood. In other words, it wasn't just that the story was wrong, it was that I deliberately made it wrong in order to do him damage. And given I hadn't even written the damn story, and given that it was a tiny little piddling story at the bottom of page 2 that didn't really matter to anybody, it was bizarre that it got to court. But of course, once it did get to court, he had to build a case. Rupert Allison defended himself. His only witness, so far as I can recall, was George Galloway. And I had to sit there.
And listen to George Galloway. But let's just take a step back for a second. So George Galloway, for a start, is quite small, isn't he? But he was known as Gorgeous George. He's got a moustache. He wears a fedora. He's not a physically large man, is he? But he's quite a confident man.
He's a great. I can remember Donald Dewar, who was, wonderful politician and a fabulous man, Scotland's first minister. And I can remember when George Galloway was running in Glasgow Hill Head. And because I had these stories of my previous encounters, it's fair to say that I wasn't particularly fond of him. And just finishing the court case, though, Rory, yeah. I had to sit there and watch George Galloway describe scenes involving me, which, given it was about me, to my certain knowledge, I know never took place. It was a very, very bizarre situation. And I can remember Donald Dewar saying Galloway is an absolutely thoroughly horrible human being, but he is never to be underestimated. Because he is a great speaker. He's a terrific orator. And the thing is, you listed there some of the places that he's been. I mean, I'd love to know what the people of Bradford think George Galloway's lasting contribution to the people of Bradford is. I suspect it won't be very much. And likewise now. So he uses these places. He latches upon them. It's now Rochdale. And just for those, I was in an event in Adelaide the other day, and I was being interviewed by Bob Carr, the former Premier of New South Wales, who mentioned the by-election and said that, this guy had come along and he'd won this by-election by speaking up for the people of Gaza. And of course, there was a round of applause, for the people. Oh, great, speak up for the people of Gaza. When, of course, I explained the background, the fact that this had happened because, the Labour candidate wasn't being backed by the Labour Party, that the guy who came second was an independent, told a little bit about the broader story. I think they maybe understood better what was going on. But I think for our politics, it's, and it's the same here. I was up at Sydney University yesterday, and plastered on all the bus stops on the way up to the event that I was doing were all these posters, Albanese, you're supporting genocide, very much sort of the same sort of perspective as the protests that have been against the government and against the Labour Party in the UK. So this issue is kind of going to the heart of our politics. But I was cheered by your introduction there, because every time Galloway has gone and won, he's lost pretty much soon afterwards. And I think that will happen again this time. Labour will get a decent candidate.
It's a bit of a sense of this guy and this phenomenon of Galloway. So he grew up working class, poor family in Dundee, became the leader of the Scottish Labour Party at a very, very young age, or the chairman of Scottish Labour anyway. As you said, did war and won, got into Parliament in 1987, and quite quickly was associated with a particular faction of the left. I mean, you can help us understand this. So he said that he was really against the Trotskyites, but he really thought the Labour Party should amalgamate with the Communist Party of Great Britain. And he referred to Tony Benn as Kerensky. Can you tell us about Labour politics in the late 80s? Go on.
No, Rory, I'm not reliving all this absolute nightmare of the historical sectology and factionalism that kept the Labour Party out of power for so long. I mean, this is why I think the Labour Party has been right to sort of, try to stay in a place where most people live their political lives. But I think there is an element of opportunism about him. In fact, there's a very big element of opportunism about him. But what his strengths are, if you're trying to be objective about it, he's very good at, he's a very good speaker. I actually once was on Question Time with him in Burnley, as it happens. And it was quite interesting because, needless to say, they put us right together. On the panel, and I think I told myself on the way in, I am not going to lose my rag. I am not going to get fired up by this guy. And of course, he sort of basically goes straight into this kind of absolutely even I was quite impressed. Thinking, I thought if this was him talking about somebody else, I could really enjoy this. As he sort of talked about, I'm sitting here next to a man who's with blood dripping from every inch of his skin and all this sort of stuff. And so he's a formidable sort of rabble rouser. But the truth is, Gaza has been difficult for the Labour Party, but Galloway was unbelievably lucky in the way that the cards fell within this by-election. There's no doubt about that. What I found very, very strange about the reaction to it, I honestly can't believe that Rishi Sunak went out in Downing Street and it was almost like George Galloway's won a by-election. I have to try and say something. I thought the whole thing was absurd.
I mean, if you look at the history of it, George Galloway is always winning by-elections. I mean, he won Bethnal Green and Bow in 2005. He won Bradford West in 2012, and he's generally winning them in the same way, isn't he?
Yeah.
He's usually winning them by in 2005. I guess he was taking position on the Iraq War, but 2012 it was Gaza again, wasn't it?
Yeah.
And he's a sort of he's particularly made his name, I guess, although his party is now called the Workers' Party of Britain.
I mean, it's just unbelievable.
He's really made his, but he's made his name really on international affairs. So he was very, very firmly pro-Palestine, one-state solution for Palestinians. He was very firmly pro-Sinn Féin in Ireland. He was notoriously went to see Saddam Hussein and praised him for his, I think, resilience.
Indefatigability.
Remained very close to...
Sir, I salute your courage and your indefatigability.
That's right. Praised Syria for being the fortress of the Arab world. So makes pro-Russian comments, quite pro-Corbyn.
Anti-Kosovo.
Yeah.
I was just talking to Fiona before we started. She was telling me that Jeremy Corbyn and somebody else were going to introduce him into the Commons, but in the end they didn't.
It's a brilliantly funny piece in The Guardian by John Crace, giving a long spiel of Corbyn claiming, "Oh dear, really, did I say 2:30 on Monday? I'm so sorry, I must have made a diary error."
The point, though, is that he, like a lot of modern political figures, it's really all about attention. And that's part of what politics is. That's not wholly a criticism. But he'll go into a place, he'll work out the best way to maximize what people know of him. And he does have a long history of, pro-Palestine, anti-Israel, and I mean anti-Israel and pro-Palestine. And so he goes in there and he'll work out the numbers. He'll work out how many people he probably needs to get across the line. There was a clip that emerged on social media of him in a private conversation. I don't think he realized he was being filmed with a voter in Rochdale who was giving him a bit of a hard time. And Galloway very quickly turned very, very nasty on this guy. I mean, I think he's a deeply unpleasant piece of works. But as Donald Dewar said, not to be underestimated. Now, I think he's going to overreach himself. He's talking now about bringing down Keir Starmer. But the Labour Party, I think, needs to be very, very conscious of this. This is something not to be ignored. But at the same time, unlike Sunak the other night, Labour shouldn't change their core strategy on this. But I do think there's a message in here for Labour politicians that ever since October the 7th, because they got locked in very, very quickly to a position of, close to the American position, close to the government position, pro the right of Israel to exist and to defend itself, I think there has been a feeling of a lack of kind of basic empathy on the issue. And that's what allows somebody like Galloway to come in and totally misrepresent Labour's position on the issue. So Labour does have to kind of respond to this. But I thought Sunak's response was ridiculously over the top.
Well, let's just do that for a second. So again, for to set the scene, he did something very unusual, which is he called a statement on the steps of Downing Street on a podium.
First time since he's been Prime Minister.
Yeah, and these things are normally used for really, really big announcements. People expect this to be you're calling a general election or you're making a statement on 9/11 or something. Yeah. So people really thought, gosh, this is going to be a really big deal. Let's hold the 6 o'clock news. This is going to be a big statement.
In recent weeks and months, we've seen a shocking increase in extremist disruption and criminality.
And in the end, what he did was give a speech, apparently inspired by George Galloway's victory, warning against extremism. And he
right and left.
And he tried to say essentially that this was, one of the most profound crises facing Britain. So there was a very hyperbolic or kind of exaggerated context in this whole thing, because the whole podium set it up as though this was going to be some incredible revelation. Anyway, what was your sense of the whole thing?
I got a sort of rash. You know how you get a rash of text messages from people. What's Sunak talking about? What's this about? And of course, I didn't have a clue. But I thought, well, this is going to be big. So you sort of tune in and you watch it. And at the end of it, I thought, what on earth was that about? And so he was basically saying that democracy is under threat from a combination of far right and Islamist fundamentalists who sort of, feel so strongly about Gaza. And Suella Braverman started this whole thing about anybody who goes on this march is somehow a sort of, a hater. And I think it was playing into the hands of the people that he seemed to be calling out. Now, he succeeded in getting all of the right-wing papers the next day to sort of give him front page treatment of, the speech that we've been longing to hear and all this sort of stuff. But I just thought it was nonsense.
Are they sincere in that? Just that for a second, because that reminds me a little bit of when Cameron came back from vetoing the EU budget, and he briefly got front page coverage in the Telegraph and the Mail saying, well done him. But you sense that they're not really on Rishi Sunak's side. And it wasn't really the speech they were desperate to hear. And in fact, in some ways, he's got I'd love to get your sense of his communication style, because it was set up as though it was going to be some sort of great Kennedy-style State of the Nation address. But to give people a sense of the culmination of it in his rhetorical style, he goes, "When they tell lies, we will tell the truth.
Oh.
When they try and sap our confidence, we will redouble our efforts."
I mean, it's like a really bad ChatGPT sort of, O-level speech. I've got to write a speech for an O-level paper. Can you sort of give me one? I mean, and the other thing, when he talks about lies and talks about undermining democracy, I just think it's a bit rich.
That presumably irritates you because that strikes you as enormously hypocritical. But before we get on the hypocrisy, can I just when they try and sap our confidence, we will redouble our efforts is not one of the great rhetorical lines of all time. And then
there's going to be no analysis of that in a century's time.
And then it finished with, "So let us go forward together, confident in our values and in our future." So I do sort of wonder whether it was a mistake of him to try to choose, because maybe his personality or his speaking style doesn't really suit this kind of stuff anyway.
I think if the moment had merited something like this, it would have been fine. And then people know that he's not Ronald Reagan, he's not Martin Luther King. But the moment didn't merit it. This is all, if you think about it, it really is all flowing from this whole sort of Lee Anderson, Islamophobia, Braverman. It was all yet again sort of playing into Tory politics. And on the hypocrisy, Rory, let me just have a couple of minutes on the hypocrisy.
Yeah.
I mean, if we're talking about undermining democracy and lying, I think Brexit and the way that it was won and the way that it was delivered undermined democracy. I think supporting newspapers to talk about enemies of the people and saboteurs was undermining democracy. Prorogue in Parliament, voter ID, corruption on COVID, free ports and special economic zones.
Suella Braverman as Home Secretary.
Yes, exactly. Within days of being sacked for breaking the code, doubling the limits on funding raised for the election without any sort of debate, undermining the Electoral Commission. And I sent it to you, Rory, I don't know if you saw it, but a friend of mine who works in this area, that is the area of digital communications and the new forms of advertising, which I don't think you and I really understand. But let me just read you what he said, because I think it's fascinating, this. He said, "I may be giving the Tories too much credit. I'm not sure they really have much control over Braverman, Anderson, etc. But I do think they have a strategy of social division. They're building an us against them on cultural, racial, religious lines rather than policies. An objective is to define and build an active base to mobilize later in the year. So a short-term tactic will be to do things which generate lots of data related to defining and building an active base." So that's the comments made by Anderson, Braverman, Sunak, Shaps, etc. "They build followers, they generate reactions online. You then use psychometric profiling to understand these people better. You then pump millions, brackets, which is why they've upped the amount people can donate, into different social media platforms, and you feed them stuff to maintain their fears and anger. In the medium term, you soften your tone publicly so as to appear electable to the centre ground, but you keep feeding that database of people really hateful stuff directly online out of the public gaze. To me, that's what's going on. They take a short-term centre ground hit to get data on people who will form their own angry mob. Medium term, they soften. Then further down the line, you make it difficult for young people to vote. You hold the election in the run-up to the Christmas when lots of middling them distracted, and you dominate the election with your angry mob, Trump style.
So let me try to on that. So some of that I think is going at stretching. Some of it I think is plausible. So there's no doubt at all they will have a very, very clear digital campaign. There's no doubt at all that they will be trying to exploit cultural cleavages. There seems to have been a leaked email from Tory headquarters, which Katie Bowles reports on in The Guardian, saying that the blame for the election of George Galloway lies with Keir Starmer, and this is Starmer's failure to fix anti-Semitism, and that Starmer's weak and unable to take position. So absolutely right that there's part
By the way, just on that, Rory, that's because they're desperate to keep trying to link Keir Starmer to having sat in and wanted Jeremy Corbyn to be Prime Minister. I think that's what that's about.
So they're going to keep hammering that, and I think they're going to build that up. I think, though, this idea that they're temporarily shifting towards a moderate soft position and some sort of cunning three-stage thing, I think is beyond them. I think what is plausible is that they're hoping to go into the election using data and digital targeting to try to mobilize their 2019 Red Wall coalition, and that's why he won't break properly and come out and fully condemn Lee Anderson in the way that he should. And that's probably, I think, the reason why we haven't seen the moves that both of us would have liked to see, the real confrontation with the right, the Conservative Party.
And talking of Lee Anderson, what did you think of Lee Anderson and Liz Truss turning up together at a Tory MP's fundraiser?
I mean, it's shocking. It's really, really shocking, because I think people are forgetting what Lee Anderson said. Lee Anderson essentially is selling a very dangerous, divisive conspiracy theory, a sort of completely unfounded, wacky conspiracy theory that Sadiq Khan is controlled by Islamists, and that there are these kind of whole no-go areas in London, all this kind of stuff. And the fact that a sitting Conservative MP is prepared to host someone like that, and apparently he got a standing ovation when he turned up, when he's been suspended from the party, is really, really bad. And, you know, again, I don't know whether it would work in party leadership terms, but one would be tempted to suspend that MP too for hosting him.
But then, and also, you know, Liz Truss is clearly delighting in just being the centre of attention wherever she goes, and she's worked out the way to become the centre of attention is to say and do things that are deliberately undermining Rishi Sunak. So any attempt that Sunak tries to make to kind of appease or to bring these factions together, it seems to me is doomed to fail. I'm not sure what I would do if I were him, but I wouldn't have done that speech on Friday. I really wouldn't. I thought it was beneath the office. I thought it just didn't merit that moment, that level of kind of drama of the lectern going up and him coming out there and saying what he said.
I think that's the bigger point, isn't it? Because I think, as we said last week, one thing that is important is to keep things in context and in proportion. And this is playing into the narrative that we're facing some existential threat in our society,
which we're not.
Which we're not. Right? There are many bigger problems in our society, and I think it's in a way you're increasing the polarization by, maybe inadvertently, but by talking about it in that way, you're.
No, I think it's advertent, because you know that you're doing it, and you've talked a lot about friends that you know, Jewish people in the Jewish community who are going around the place and being abused and being spat at and all this sort of stuff. Well, there's plenty of stuff you can see on local and social media at the moment of the same sort of thing happening to people who happen to, quotes, look like Muslims, close quotes, because of the stuff that Anderson has been pumping out. And by playing to it rather than condemning it, I think Sunak adds to that momentum and that sense of polarization.
Of course, he would say that he is condemning it, isn't it? He would say that in his speech he was
and he did, and he withdrew the whip.
Yeah,
he withdrew the whip.
Yeah,
I agree. But then the whole, we talked last week about this whole nonsense. Well, what he said was wrong and inappropriate, but they can't bring themselves to say what was wrong about it. And what do you think about? Do you think the budget? So we're recording Monday UK time. So this will go out. The budget will be very live, and some people will listen to this after the budget. So we won't waste our time predicting what's in the budget. But do you think that this is their last shot? And do you think that if they do go very heavily down this, let's get all the money from under the sofa and try and sort of give some sort of big tax cut, do you think that actually is potentially a game changer in the right way for them, or could it actually make things worse?
I think it could make things worse. So fundamental position, the economy's not in a great state. Growth is flatlining or actually technically going into recession. And because our population is growing, in fact, GDP per capita, so the wealth per person, has actually been declining. So that, yes, there are theoretically a few billions that are there to, as it were, play with. But a few things to point out. One is that you need a bit of insurance room if the economy moves in the wrong direction. You want a bit of money. Secondly, public services are under a lot of pressure, and you want some money to put into public services. And thirdly, there are things like fuel duty, which they're always trying to deal with, which costs them a few billion anyway. So last time round in the autumn statement, in fact, Jeremy Hunt avoided the temptation to come up with big, catchy tax cuts. Instead, he made a pretty technocratic decision on allowing businesses to lay off some of their investment in capital equipment against tax, which I think was a smart move. And I came out with some respect for Jeremy Hunt from that, because I thought it's not a very popular move, but it's a good thing to do for the economy. So I'm going into this budget with my fingers and toes crossed and hoping that Jeremy Hunt holds his nerve and thinks about his legacy, because I don't think he honestly can believe any more than you and I that the Conservatives are going to win the next election. So let's see them at least play it cautiously and responsibly, rather than do something showy which isn't going to do them any good electorally anyway.
I saw a poll the other day saying that he's quite vulnerable in his own seat, and that if there was a lot of tactical voting, I think it would be in favour of the Liberal Democrats there, that he'd be in a lot of trouble. But I think we're back to the point that we've talked about a lot, that this is all driven by these pressures within the Conservative Party as opposed to the genuine national economic interest. And of course, the other thing I think we've talked about before is that the costs of interest on borrowing have gone up so substantially since he was talking about having all this sort of unexpected headroom. So I think it feels like it could be a bit desperate, but I don't think he will hold out against it. I think he will try to go for something.
Well, part of the problem, as we talked about in the past, is there's a media management problem, isn't there? Because they have raised expectations about tax cuts, and that slightly traps them. I don't know whether they've managed to talk their way out of it. Is your sense going into it a day and a half out that they've sort of hinted that there are going to be tax cuts, so there's going to be huge disappointment when they're not, or have they managed to avoid that?
I think they're trying to wind it down a little bit. I mean, I'm just shocked at the way. Jeremy Hunt was doing lots of interviews over the weekend, and I mean, all the sort of traditional pre-budget rules seem to have completely broken down. I think I'd be very surprised if they don't find some way of having a couple of quite surprising tax cutting measures. But I fear that if they've really had to struggle to find out where the money's coming from, that there's the potential for unraveling very, very quickly. So you could end up with one of those classic situations where on the day itself, all the Tories are out there saying, this is fantastic. The Tory papers all saying this is fantastic. And then within 24 hours or so, people start to look at the detail and it unravels. The people to watch out for, I think, on budget day are the OBR, the Office of Budget Responsibility, the ones that Liz Truss tried to cut out of the equation, Paul Johnson from the Institute of Fiscal Studies, and Torsten Bell at the Resolution Foundation. I think when I look for the judgment of outsiders on this, because I think they do go through the numbers very, very quickly, and they come up with something that's sort of.
Well, I went through this 3 times, in fact, being in budget. So as a an MP, you turn up very loyally for budget. You stand there, you hear your Chancellor, in this case, if you were a Conservative MP, it'd be Jeremy Hunt speaking. And there's lots of little giveaways. So, I would hear in my constituency there's a bit of money for the A66 road or our train station. And there'd be nice talk about apprenticeships. And you'd leave with a kind of warm, buzzy feeling. And then, as you say, within about 6 hours, somebody like Paul Johnson starts biting into the details of the whole thing. And the whole thing then, on 3 occasions at least, in the nearly 10 years I was in, the budget kind of collapsed around our ears. George Osborne actually famously had a budget that did that, where it came unstuck. I think different ones came unstuck in different ones, but one of them famously came unstuck around a pasty tax.
Oh, that was yeah, I remember the pasty tax. There was, which was the omnishambles. There was an omnishambles budget as
That's
well,
right.
wasn't there?
I think that's 2012.
Okay. I remember once at the Daily Mirror I wrote a speculative piece about the budget, and I didn't say this is going to happen. I was all this sort of couched in very kind of speculative language. But I remember Richard Stott, the editor, calling me and he said, "Have you seen the budget?" I said, "No, of course I haven't." He said, "Well, why are you writing all this crap then?" But now all we get is crap about, what might be, what might not be. But I think the other thing I've been a little bit surprised by, even with this lot, is the extent to which so much of the briefing around the budget is about laying traps for Labour. And I think the one thing where I think they might do something on the non-dom thing. I think he might sort of play away with that, not necessarily get rid of the whole thing, but sort of, make changes to it. So as you can say, we're actually taking money from the very wealthy as well, but also because Labour are, talking about funding all sorts of things by scaling back the non-dom tax status. So that's my little completely ill-informed prediction of what might happen.
Very good. Thank you, Alastair. Let's see if we're right.
Rory, I've got breaking news.
Oh, yes, go on.
Well, the first 2 venues of our tour, what we hope and think will be an election tour, to sell out.
October, coming in October.
Yeah. Are Glasgow and Brighton.
Very good.
Amazingly, the people who know about these things say that as they track the sales of O2 tickets, that it's heading in the same direction. And I hope you were very, very excited the other day, Rory, when you joined me for a Restless Politics Australia special. Australia, by the way, has now overtaken Ireland as the country with our most listeners after the UK.
Very good. And after Tuvalu dropped off the list.
Tuvalu went off the list. And but I don't know if you know that the venue that where I was physically and you were beamed in, that the Beatles played there in the 60s.
Oh,
so that was so exciting. Without Ringo Starr, Jimmy Nichols stood in for
I've
Ringo
got
Starr.
somebody, given that you're a Swiftie, I've got someone working on seeing if we can persuade Taylor Swift to come on the show, if you're up for that.
Rory, Taylor Swift coming on the show would be I'd be almost as excited as if we got Angela Merkel. How about that? Taylor Swift, by the way, she's all
at the same time. Yeah,
she's all over the media here at the moment because the Australians are hosting the ASEAN nations. We're going to talk about that, and the ASEAN leaders are all a bit pissed off with Singapore because Singapore has been paying very substantial sums of money to Taylor Swift to appear in Singapore, but the money seems to be in return for her not going to all the other nations in the region. So she's doing,
oh goodness,
on her world tour, she's doing a whole load of performances in Singapore, but she's not going elsewhere. So thereby underlining, just as she's got a bit of political clout in America, so in this region as well. Well, if people want those tickets that are left, you just go to the restlesspolitics.com, you see all the dates there, and you can sign up.
Well, can I from our own correspondent, dump you in it and say you're in Australia and you love Australia, actually. I get a sense that it's one of those places, along with Ireland, that you have a huge affection for. So tell us a bit of a sense of what impression you're getting of Australian politics and of how Australian politics looks at the world.
Well, I do like Australia. I've never not had a really good time here. I think it's got so much of the kind of the best of what people like about Britain, but I do think it's less stuffy. I think they have less of a kind of class structure. Look, I think there are some big problems, and I still think that, I do think it was really sad that the voice referendum was defeated. I think there are still massive challenges related to the lives and the treatment of the Indigenous population. But there's something incredibly vibrant about Australia and about Australian people. And I think on the politics, it's really interesting at the moment because they have these ridiculous 3-year terms. So even though Anthony Albanese is quite a kind of, his election wasn't that long ago, but they're already into the kind of period of the next pre-election phase. Interestingly, last night, Rory, I had a pretty big event, and we did the thing that you and I often do about who's going to be the next Labour Prime Minister, and it was 100% Starmer. Who's going to be the next American president, and it was 2-1 Trump. And when it came to who's going to be the next Australian prime minister after the next election, it was very, very, very strongly Albanese. So I think there is a sense they're doing pretty well. There was a by-election last weekend, which the Liberals, which is their Tory party, which they thought they were going to win, and they didn't. Albanese held on. I'll tell you what has been very interesting in here. As I say, they're hosting the ASEAN leaders, which are all the sort of 10 leaders of big countries in Southeast Asia. Singapore and Indonesia are probably the two most significant in a way. But and the front pages of the papers today are full of Albanese announcing more money to invest in Southeast Asian interests. And I think they do see their future very much, as it were, in this region. But I went at the Adelaide Festival that I was speaking at. I went to a couple of panels on the whole AUKUS.
Just quickly remind people that this was the deal where France was due to build submarines with Australia. It was a huge deal for France, going to make a lot of difference to the French defense industry. And then to the complete fury of France, the US and Britain seemed to cut them out of the equation, leaving the French, almost at the bit of withdrawing their ambassadors, mounting formal political protests, etc.
Yeah.
Anyway, yes, fast forward then on how that's all going.
Well, it's really interesting because, of course, it's a very long-term thing, and it sort of depends where you are and who you're talking to. So when I was in South Australia and I met the Premier there who introduced us at the event that we did, Peter Malinauskas, and he was basically saying it's great because the submarines, that's where they'll kind of a lot of the jobs that come from this are going to be based there. So they were very much in favour. You go to other places and it feels very kind of they're very unsure about it. And so last night, somebody was pointing out that this was a deal that was put together by Biden, Johnson, and Morrison. Well, Morrison and Johnson are gone. Biden, if he is replaced by Trump, I think the feeling is here that Trump is just not going to give a damn about, America funding Australian submarine projects when he's got a sort of America first policy. And I think there's a feeling that people aren't sure about what the plan B is. And there's been a surprise. This was very much Morrison's project, but Albanese has taken it over. But I got the feeling, talking to lots of people, both in politics and there were a few defence experts at this event, there's a sort of sense that this thing might not happen in the end. That the time scale is so long, that the costs are so long. And there is definitely a real sort of fear of Trump. There's a real fear of Trump returning, that if he does return, that Australia just kind of won't be on his map in the way that it is with Joe Biden. And I'll tell you the other really depressing thing, Rory. One panel with 4 experts on this subject. The panel was about AUKUS and the future of AUKUS. And I promise you, the UK bit was not even mentioned. It was really kind of, I just thought, God, I was thinking, imagine if this had been put together by Thatcher and Reagan or by Clinton and Blair, the British element would feel to be a big part of it. It just didn't feel like it was part of it.
And how much do you think the UK is still kind of culturally part of the Australian debate, or is UK politics still?
Oh, no.
People are still conscious UK politics, conscious of the thing. It's just the AUKUS that is much less relevant.
No. There's no doubt that when you're going around the place, people follow. Not everybody, but there is people really know what's going on in British politics. There's a hell of a lot of interest in British politics, and I think there's a lot of sadness at what Britain has become. And I met. I felt for you, Rory, because I know you love the Teals, and I met some of the Teals. These are women.
Wait! I hope you've got them to agree to be interviewed. These amazing women.
Rory. Yes, of course, Rory. Yes, of course. Unlike you, I pin people down and I get them to. At some point, we'll be doing, very senior politicians from this country and indeed from other countries who are present at ASEAN. But they do follow it very, very, very closely. But the Teals were fascinating.
Can I just sort of remind people they're called Teals because they are environmentally green, but fiscally conservative, hence blue-green. And they're independents, many of them women, some of them doctors.
All of them women.
And took these key seats, quite prosperous seats, in a surprise victory, which really was about, we always saw as one of the optimistic sense of a return to the centre ground.
Yeah, and what's really the other thing is that if you come into Australia, Rory, and you want to, if you're making a speech and you feel you're flagging at any point, just do a big thing about how amazing you think compulsory voting is, because they're unbelievably proud of that. And I completely agree. It's like I just think compulsory voting.
Totally with you. I couldn't agree more. My friend John in Cumbria thinks I'm mad, but I think his only argument against it is that he doesn't really trust voters.
Well,
I think our democracy has to be based on the assumption that we trust everybody. Everybody should vote. Everybody should be equal citizens, and everyone should have a say.
But I think one of the reasons why the debate feels more informed, partly, I mean, look, their papers are very influenced by Murdoch, and not great. But I do feel people are generally more informed, and I think one of the reasons is that actually they understand that at some stage they're all going to have to vote. And I think it helps the debate. I think what the politicians say about compulsory voting is that it makes it much harder for the extremists to get a real grip. Now, there is a hard right problem here. There's a probably not as advanced as it is in Europe, but it exists. But I think compulsory voting has been a great thing for them. And I really, really wish that we'd go down the same road. And the other thing that's happening, Rory, is there's a lot of movement on. I know this is something you feel strongly about, political funding. So the Premier in South Australia, Peter Malinauskas, he's bringing forward a bill to ban all political donations and to have state funding of parties.
Fantastic. That's what I like.
And at the federal level, they're also talking about not quite going that far, but they are going to a place of having very, very kind of pretty low limits on what people can spend. So there's just that sort of sense of, I think, greater vibrancy.
I mean, if people are really interested in the geekiness of this, these are great subjects to get into some days. I mean, the argument against people like me who favor state funding is they see it as a challenge to freedom, and it sounds kind of quite authoritarian, and maybe it's difficult for new parties to break in and stuff. But I think you've got to weigh lesser evils, and I think state funding is a much lesser evil than allowing wealthy business people to fund the Tories or wealthy unions to fund Labour, and all that means for the mad policies that generates.
The argument that is being used against the South Australian Premier and his plans to ban all political donations is freedom. They're using the freedom of speech argument, and that's probably going to end up in the courts. But I really, really hope he wins. And I also think so there's no doubt. I mean, there's your friend King Charles is due to be coming here in the not too distant future. And I was with quite a lot of young people at the university yesterday, and I was saying, do people care much? And they were saying, oh, not really. But then I was talking to some of the older people, and they were saying, yeah, well, they might say that, but you watch when he comes here, there'll still be quite a turnout. But one of them did say, you won't be happy with this, Rory, but one of them did say, I said, yeah, I mean, there won't be much for the King and Camilla, but I'll tell you, if Harry and Meghan came, there'd be crowds.
Right. Well, we'll go. Now let's move on to the serious subject of Sudan. So we don't, you really wanted us to focus on Sudan today, and I think that's really important because it's probably the most dramatic, extreme, and horrifying thing happening in the world at the moment. And almost nobody is talking about it. We've covered it a bit. We've done a few episodes, but not enough. I was stopped by a woman in the streets of London who's actually my local Conservative councillor, who's Sudanese British, who really said, why are you not doing more in Sudan? Good. And the statistics are absolutely horrifying. So effectively, there's a civil war between two sides, and we can explain that a little bit in a second. But 8 or 10 million people have been displaced from their homes out of a population of about 40 million, so about a quarter of the population.
3 million, over 3 million children.
The healthcare facilities almost entirely collapsed. A lot of the cities lying in ruins, and these horrifying, basically militia groups. I mean, some of them technically from the Rapid Reaction Force, some of them who call themselves the Sudanese army, but increasingly the distinction between these armed groups is becoming pretty blurred. You had the Sudanese army walking down the street carrying the decapitated heads of students that they thought were connected to the RRF. Anyway, over to you. Maybe we can get a bit into the background of it in a second.
Yeah, I mean, the numbers are staggering, and of course, you accept that Ukraine, massive international story, Israel, Gaza, massive international story. The kind of emotions that are being inspired by the suffering of both of the attacks on October the 7th, but also the horrors of what are happening in Gaza now. I mean, it's obvious to understand why people feel so strongly about it, and yet, as you say, this is something that, because it doesn't get much attention, there's no similar outpouring for what is, in certainly in numerical terms, greater suffering. And also with, there's so much going on here between these two sides, so the Sudanese armed forces and the rapid support forces, they were at war in Darfur sort of 2 decades ago. But what's, I think, different now is that there's a far greater international element to this, and a lot of this has to do with gold. Egypt is getting gold from the areas under the army control, and the gold from the rapid support forces is heading particularly to the United Arab Emirates, and it's without them sort of wanting to be part of a solution. It seems to me the problem doesn't get resolved. And we've talked a lot in recent weeks about just how big Biden's kind of in tray of challenges is. But again, he's expected to play a role in this. He's appointed a special envoy now, a guy called Tom Perriello, who did a similar job in the DRC for Obama. The UN have just put in a new peacekeeping envoy. But these proxies, you've got the UAE, you've got Egypt, you've got the Wagner Group, you've got Iran, who are supplying arms to one side. And so people are talking about, the need for a ceasefire, the need for humanitarian aid access. But with all this bigger play politics going on around it, it's very, very difficult.
Again, just set up the geography for people. So Sudan is a country which is on the east side of Africa, along the edge of the Red Sea. So it's right there below Egypt, just sits below Egypt. It's got a port called Port Sudan, which is right opposite Saudi Arabia. But on its west-hand side and its left-hand side, it stretches right into the Libyan desert and connects with the Sahel, with this whole chain of countries which are on the edge of the Sahara, which have seen military coups and the collapse of democratic governments, right the way from the east coast of Africa to the west coast of Africa that we've been discussing. 2 main fighting groups. On the one hand, as you say, the Sudanese army, led by General al-Burhan, and they're mostly traditionally in the east of the country, along the Nile River, in what traditionally was the kind of more settled, richer, more fertile territory. And they tend to have more of the support, I guess, of the urban population, the intelligentsia, the business elite. And they are backed by Egypt and Iran. And against them is this man, Hemeti, with the Rapid Reaction Force. And Hemeti, as we've discussed before on the program, grew up in a camel herding background. He comes from the West, from this much more Arab, semi-nomadic backgrounds. And he's got these recruits who are, again, mostly from the drier areas of Sahel. They're backed by the UAE, and in fact were used by the UAE as mercenaries in Yemen. He's got businesses in UAE, and there's been some amazing reporting that we discussed briefly if people want to really get into the geekery of this, which the New York Times got into, where they used satellite images to show that the UAE had set up a hospital in Chad, so on the western side of Sudan, which was basically being used to take in cargo planes which were delivering rockets, drones from the Emirates to Hemeti and the Rapid Reaction Force. And this is another example of somewhere where we're losing faith in peace. But actually, peace in Sudan isn't impossible. I mean, it's somewhere where if the international community concentrated properly, you would be able to get there more with more confidence, I think, than you might be able to in Russia, Ukraine, or Israel, Gaza. And the sad truth is, you're right that the US has now appointed a presidential envoy, but for a long time they didn't. The State Department was digging its heels in, insisting that the Africa Bureau could do it. And the Africa Bureau simply didn't have the contacts that it needed with Saudi, UAE, and other key players to really get this stuff sorted.
Yeah, there is also a Ukraine element to this, I think, because Hemdeti, who is a pretty, I mean, you know, I don't suppose he would come on leading, but he's a very, I mean, you know, he became powerful and wealthy because he was very close to the former head of state, Omar al-Bashir. And that's when he started to get access to a lot of the gold resources. He then turned on his master, as it were, helped to get rid of him, joined a transitional government for a short period of time, then took part in another coup. And within the Russian context, though, it's been reported pretty widely that he's helped Russia access billions worth of Sudanese gold, sort of laundered in various complicated ways that I don't understand. And I think our own parliament, the Foreign Affairs Committee, did a report last summer, I think it was, reckoning that the Wagner Group was earning more than $1 billion through this gold smuggling, which was absolutely essential for helping Russia to carry on the Ukraine effort despite all the sanctions.
Yeah. You talked about the Ukraine angle, but it really matters for the Red Sea. I mean, Sudan matters for the Red Sea. It matters for the Sahel. It matters for North Africa. It matters for the Horn of Africa.
It also matters for Israel, Gaza, because, of course, America needs all of these different countries, Egypt, UAE, the Saudis, to help out on that as well. So, you know, we've talked a lot about that David Miliband line about, you know, the age of impunity. I mean, you're looking to people who, on the one hand, you're saying, please stop doing this nefarious stuff that's helping this war in this part of the world. And meanwhile, we'd like you to help us do this to try to bring peace in this other war in a different part of the world.
Yeah. The ICG, the International Crisis Group, we've done a great interview, which people may want to listen to again, with Comfort Ero, who's the head of Crisis Group. And Crisis Group's produced a really good paper showing how peace could happen. And what they basically argue is that you've got to be prepared to negotiate with these armed people without conditions. And that the problem is that the US has been saying, we won't talk to Hemeti, we need these conditions. Saudi's been saying we can't have UAE involved in the discussions. Basically, you need to bring them to talks with no preconditions. You need an unconditional ceasefire. You need to get Cairo, Egypt, and UAE on side. And you need to be very flexible. I mean, there's so many egos now involved because there's a Saudi process, it's an Egyptian process, a sort of Ethiopian process. But it is exactly where the US used to be able to come in and coordinate these sort of things and lean on people. And I'm afraid an example of something we talk about, which is that as the US has slightly withdrawn and Biden hasn't taken a particular personal interest in Sudan, it's not that the world stabilizes, it's that you end up with half a dozen other players getting involved.
Well, I hope the next time you meet your local councillor that she thinks at least we've tried to give it a go and explain it. But it is absolutely, it is horrifying what's happening there, and not easy at this stage to see how and where it ends.
Well, Alastair, a slightly depressing end, but I'm going to finish just with that final thought again, which is just to say we must keep believing in peace and keep believing it can be done, and it has been done, and it can totally be done in Sudan if people believe and commit to it. And it's also true that in the end we can get to peace even with Israel Gaza if people believe in it and commit to it, however gloomy the world seems at the moment.
See you soon.
Bye-bye.